"The wedding was called off, Dad. We need some quiet." Julian said it while I was still closing the last drawer of the wedding cabinet I had built for him. I believed him. I sent him every bit of my remaining savings. But that night, on a phone I borrowed from the neighbors, I saw my son standing in a seaside garden, lit up like a dream. Perfect suit, glass raised, surrounded by a lavish wedding. There was only one strange thing. In that photo, there was no place for me or my wife. Before I go on, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. And now, let me go back to the beginning, back to the moment when I still believed. It was all just a misunderstanding. I didn't say anything else to Julian after that call. I set the phone down on the wooden table, still smelling of fresh sawdust, and sat there for a long time. The dressing cabinet I was building for my son's wedding was almost finished. For 3 months, I'd been going into the workshop earlier than usual, every morning, working slowly, measuring every corner, again and again. I chose aged walnut wood, the kind that grows darker the longer it's used. It reminded me of what I believed family was supposed to be. Julian once told me he didn't need an elaborate gift. "Just save your strength for Mom," he said. But I kept building it anyway, not out of obligation. It was simply the only way I knew how to show love. I was never good with gentle words. I've always let my hands speak for me. The call about the canceled wedding came in the afternoon. Julian's voice sounded tired, low, and rushed, like he'd rehearsed it. He said Vanessa's family was having financial trouble. He said they were both under a lot of pressure. Then he asked, almost pleaded, that his mother and I not ask questions, not call anyone, just let things settle. When he finished, I said only one thing: "I understand." That evening I told Cynthia as carefully as I could. My wife had just been through a heart procedure, and the doctor warned us to avoid any strong emotions. She sat in her chair, one hand resting on her chest, listening to every word. I didn't give details. I only said the wedding was postponed, that the kids were going through a hard time. Cynthia stayed quiet for a long moment, then asked, "Is our son okay?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure. Later I went into my study and opened the small safe hidden behind the bookshelf. There wasn't much inside. Just a few old papers, a savings book, and an envelope I kept for emergencies. I knew Julian wouldn't ask directly. But I also knew he was waiting. I transferred $45,000, the money I'd saved over many years after retiring, into my son's account. When the system confirmed the transaction, I let out a breath as if I'd just fulfilled the last responsibility of a father. 2 days later, the workshop felt empty. I couldn't bring myself to keep working. I covered the cabinet with a cloth and told myself I'd finish it when things settled down. That afternoon, I sat on the front porch watching the familiar road running through our quiet Charleston suburb. Everything looked the same. Only inside me, something felt off. What happened next was pure coincidence. A young neighbor who lived alone stopped by to ask how to fix a sagging door. After he finished, I invited him to stay for a glass of water. The conversation drifted to things I didn't really understand. Social media images, blocked accounts. I mentioned casually that I hadn't seen any news about my son's wedding lately. He smiled and asked if I'd tried searching from a different account. I didn't understand. He borrowed my phone, tapped around for a few minutes, then turned the screen toward me. At first, I saw a profile I didn't recognize. No familiar name. Then I saw the images. A close-up of a wedding invitation. Julian and Vanessa's names embossed clearly, the date and time right there. The venue was a seaside estate, not far from my house. The time, tonight. I didn't say a word. I looked carefully, afraid I might be mistaken. The neighbor sensed something was wrong, apologized quickly, and handed the phone back. I thanked him and walked him to the door. After I closed it, I leaned against the wall and stood still. There was no dramatic shock, like in the movies. Just a long, hollow silence. Long enough for me to hear the clock on the wall ticking. I didn't tell Cynthia. I didn't want to disrupt the steady breathing she'd just begun to regain. I made tea, carried it into her room, and told her I was stepping out for a bit. She looked at me, searching my face, but didn't ask. Maybe she was used to me carrying heavy things on my own. Out on the porch, I opened the image again. The lights, the flowers, the tables set with care. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect for a wedding that was supposedly canceled. And that's when I understood something simple and painful. My son didn't need his parents at the most important moment of his life. Not because of circumstances, but because of a choice. I thought about my hands rough with old calluses. I thought about the suit I planned to wear if I'd been invited. I thought about our old wooden house, the place where Julian grew up. Those things I realized probably didn't fit into the picture my son was painting for his new life. Night was falling. I shut off the lights in the workshop and locked the door carefully. The dressing cabinet was still there, unfinished. For the first time in my life, I didn't know what I was going to do next. But I knew one thing for sure. This silence wasn't the end. It was just the moment I began to see the truth piece by piece. I didn't sleep that night, not out of anger, but because my mind kept circling one simple question. Why? What had I done so wrong that I could be erased from my own child's life, as if I had never existed? The next morning, I woke earlier than usual. I made coffee, sat across from Cynthia, and listened as she told me about a mild bout of fatigue during the night. I nodded, asked just enough, handed her her medicine on time. I didn't mention the photos. Not because I thought she couldn't handle the truth, but because I didn't yet know how I was supposed to face it myself. When Cynthia went to rest, I called Frank. Frank is my cousin. He worked in law enforcement for many years before retiring. We aren't close in the way that means daily conversations, but there's a trust between us that doesn't need explaining. I said only one thing. Frank, I need you to drive me somewhere. Nothing loud. On the other end, he was quiet for a few seconds, then said, I'm on my way. During the drive, I didn't say much. I just showed Frank the address on my phone. He glanced at it and frowned. That's one of the largest seaside estates in this area, he said. I nodded. We drove slowly. No music. When we arrived, I asked Frank to stop some distance from the main gate. I didn't want to go in right away. I needed to see clearly, from afar, before accepting anything. In front of me was a carefully decorated space. Lights lined the entrance. Luxury cars parked in neat rows. It looked like a world I'd only ever seen on a screen. Then I saw Julian. My son stood among a group of well-dressed guests, smiling, talking with ease. He didn't look like someone going through a crisis. He looked confident, comfortable, like he was exactly where he wanted to be. I stared hard, afraid I might be mistaken. But no, it was Julian, the child I once held in my arms, the boy I taught how to drive his first nail. Frank didn't say a word. He just sat there letting me look, letting me understand. After a while, I saw Julian turn to speak with an older man, likely someone from the bride's family. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the gestures. Julian leaned in, lowered his voice, his face serious. The man nodded and placed a hand on Julian's shoulder, a gesture of sympathy. Frank quietly played the audio from a short video he'd managed to record from a distance. Julian's voice came through, clearer than I expected. My parents passed away a long time ago. I came up from nothing. Everything I have today I built on my own. I didn't react right away. There was no sudden burst of anger. Just a coldness, spreading slowly from my chest down into my hands. And in that moment I understood what I hadn't dared to name the night before. In the story Julian was telling about his life, Cynthia and I didn't belong. And anything that doesn't belong gets erased. I thought about the money I had just transferred. I thought about the overtime hours. The nights Cynthia waited for me with cold dinners. All of that in Julian's eyes was probably just an inconvenient past. Frank tightened his grip on the steering wheel. You don't have to stay here, he said quietly. We can go back. I shook my head. Not yet, I said. I need to see more. We sat there a while longer. I saw Vanessa appear dressed in pure white, her smile radiant. She didn't look this way. Maybe she knew we shouldn't be here. Maybe she was the one who decided that. But in that moment, I didn't want to find someone to blame. I just wanted to understand. That's when the bitter irony hit me. Julian was ashamed of my poverty. But it was that very poverty that fed everything he was showing off today. My rough hands, my worn clothes, my modest wooden house, all of it laid the foundation for the luxurious life he was now enjoying. When Frank started the engine to head back, I looked at the estate one last time. The lights were still shining. Laughter still floated through the air. No one knew that an old man had just been erased from his son's life story, sitting in an aging car outside. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. This silence was different from the one the night before. It wasn't vague anymore. It had shape. I knew I couldn't go back to pretending I hadn't seen, hadn't heard, nothing. When we got home, Cynthia was asleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe evenly. I understood then that if I stayed silent, it wouldn't just be Julian denying me. I would be denying my own worth. I went back to the workshop. I pulled the cloth off the dressing cabinet. Warm yellow light fell over the wood grain I had sanded, smooth inch by inch. For the first time, I didn't see it as a wedding gift. I saw it as a reminder. Some things are made with patience and honesty, and some things are built only under temporary lights. I sat down, slowing my breath. I wasn't thinking about making a scene. I wasn't thinking about confrontation. I only knew this: if Julian had chosen to tell a story without me, then it was time for me to step into that story in my own way. Not to destroy it, but to expose the truth he was trying so hard to hide. I didn't make a decision that night. I let everything settle, the way I always do with wood after planing it down. If you rush it, the grain cracks. If you force it, it warps. I knew I needed a pause. Not to avoid anything, but to face it clearly. The next morning I woke early. I made tea and opened the window, letting the sea air move through the old house. Cynthia was still asleep. Her breathing was steady and light. I watched her for a moment, then quietly closed the door. I didn't want to pull her into something she didn't need to carry yet. At least, not now. Frank arrived just as the sun cleared the tree line. He didn't ask if I was sure. He only asked, "What do you want to do?" I thought for a few seconds, then said, "I'm going to show up, but not to make a scene." Frank looked at me, weighing it. "You know exactly what that means," he said. I nodded. I wasn't looking for sympathy. I wasn't looking for a confrontation. I just wanted to stand where I belonged, say what needed to be said, and then step away. We sat at the kitchen table. I took a small wooden box from the safe. Frank looked surprised when he saw it. I'd made that box myself many years ago, out of plain wood, no decoration. Julian once looked at it and laughed, said things like that were outdated. I didn't explain then. I didn't explain now. Inside were the papers I'd organized the night before. Nothing secret. Just numbers, signatures, dates. The money I'd loaned Julian for his investments. The times I'd co-signed for him. The withdrawal records from Cynthia's retirement fund. Money Julian had promised to repay. I didn't keep these as weapons. I kept them because in a family, clarity matters. Frank flipped through the pages slowly. "You've been very patient," he said. I didn't answer. Whether I'd been patient or not didn't matter anymore. What mattered was what I was going to do with the truth. We kept the planning simple. No complicated strategy. I wouldn't call ahead. I wouldn't ask for a private meeting. I would arrive as a guest, in the literal sense. Frank offered to lend me his formal suit, the one he only wore on the most important occasions. I refused at first. Then I understood. Not to prove anything, but so no one could say I didn't belong. When I put the suit on, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. The man looking back at me wasn't much different from yesterday. Same wrinkles, same tired eyes. But my back was straighter, not because of the suit, but because I'd decided not to bow my head anymore. Frank pulled his old car out of the garage. He'd kept it in good shape. Clean glass, polished paint. Not a car that drew attention, but respectable enough. We didn't talk much on the drive. I looked out the window, letting the scenery pass, reminding myself that I wasn't in a hurry. As we got close to the estate, I asked Frank to stop for a moment. I opened the wooden box and checked everything one last time. Nothing missing. Nothing extra. I closed the lid and set it on my lap. My hands weren't shaking. That surprised me. Maybe because I'd already passed the hardest part. What remained was simply facing it. Frank looked at me. "If you change your mind, we can turn back," he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "If I turn back now, I'll have to live with that every day." We drove through the gate. No one stopped us. Maybe it was the suit. Maybe it was Frank. Or maybe no one imagined a man like me would have any reason to be there. I walked slowly, feeling each step on the stone path. The sounds inside grew clearer. Music, conversation, laughter. I didn't look for Julian right away. I stood at the edge of the garden and looked around. Unfamiliar faces, expensive clothes. I didn't feel lost. I just felt different, and that no longer made me ashamed. Frank stayed a few steps back, not interfering. I held the wooden box with both hands. It was light, but what it carried wasn't. I waited, not out of fear, but because I wanted to choose the right moment. I didn't come to interrupt a story. I came to end a lie. When the host began introducing the groom's speech, I knew it was time. I took a deep breath, not to find courage, but to keep my voice steady. I stepped forward. The lights were brighter than I expected. I heard a few murmurs. Some people turned to look. Some looked surprised. I didn't search for Julian's eyes yet. I looked straight toward the stage, where my son was about to speak about a life that didn't include me. In that moment, I understood one thing clearly. I wasn't there to reclaim my own honor. I was there to draw a line between silent endurance and self-respect. And as I took one more step, I knew that no matter how it ended, I would never have to ask why again. The stage lights blinded me for the first few seconds. I stood still, letting my eyes adjust to the brightness. The chatter below softened, then stopped completely, as if someone had closed the door on a crowded room. I heard the host hesitate, then trail off mid-sentence. Julian was holding his glass, turning toward me. When our eyes met, I caught a flash of confusion, quickly replaced by a polite smile he put on like a mask. I took one more step forward. Slow, steady. I wasn't in a hurry. I'd waited too long to be here to rush these few seconds. I heard someone whisper Julian's name. I heard chairs shifting. And I heard my own heartbeat, calm, even not pounding the way I'd imagined it would. Julian spoke first. His voice carried through the microphone, trying to stay composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, there seems to be a misunderstanding." I raised my hand. Not to interrupt, but to ask permission. A small gesture. Enough to make him stop. "I apologize for the interruption," I said. My voice sounded unfamiliar in that space. "I won't take long." A few quiet breaths of relief moved through the crowd, as if people hoped I'd be quick. I understood. No one comes to a celebration to listen to another family's troubles. I didn't come to complain either. I looked straight at Julian. "Congratulations," I said. "I was truly impressed by the story you just shared. There's only one small detail that troubled me." I paused just long enough for every eye to turn toward us. "In that story, your mother and I disappeared. The air froze." I said nothing for a few seconds after that. The silence did the rest of the work. Julian pressed his lips together. His hand tightened around the glass. I didn't see anger in his eyes. I saw fear, the kind that comes when someone realizes the wall they built isn't as solid as they thought. "I came here," I continued, "not to demand a place, and not to embarrass you. I brought only a wedding gift, the final one." I set the wooden box on the podium in front of the microphone. The sound of wood against metal was dry and clear. I opened the lid. Inside was the original check for $45,000, still bearing the confirmation mark. I held it up so everyone could see. "This morning," I said, "I sent this money to my son because he told me the wedding had been canceled and that his family was in trouble." A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. I didn't look down. I looked straight at Julian. I realize now that I misunderstood. "So, I'm taking back that gift." I tore the check in half. Not violently, not for show, just a clean final motion. The pieces fell onto the podium light as dust. Julian stepped forward halfway, then stopped. Vanessa stood beside him, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't look at her. Not out of disrespect. This story didn't need another person in it. I took the remaining documents from the box. "I have no intention of airing private matters," I said, "but when a story is told wrong, the truth sometimes needs to be placed on the table. I didn't read every page. I named only what mattered. Loans never repaid, withdrawals made without Cynthia's consent, luxury expenses hidden under the word investment." I stopped when a middle-aged man in the front row stood up. Vanessa's father. He looked at Julian, then at me, his expression heavy. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Julian opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was no answer strong enough in that moment. "Let me be clear," I said, my voice still even. "I didn't come to reclaim anything for myself. I came to return something my son gave up too early. Honesty." I closed the wooden box. "From this moment on, you're free. Free from the father you decided didn't fit into your life." I stepped back. Frank was already nearby, silent as a shadow. I didn't wait for a reaction. I didn't need an apology. I had said what I came to say. Behind me, the celebration lost its rhythm. Voices overlapped. Someone called Julian's name. Chairs shifted again. I didn't turn around. I walked slowly along the stone path out of the light. When the gate closed behind me, I took a deep breath. The air outside was cooler, quieter. Frank opened the car door. I sat down, resting my hands on my lap. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt light, On the drive home, I watched the lights fade in the rearview mirror. I thought of Cynthia, of the old wooden house, of the unfinished dressing cabinet in my workshop. I knew that from this moment on, everything would change. Not because I'd done something dramatic, but because I had stopped being silent. And sometimes, that's all it takes for a false story to collapse on its own. I got home late that night. The house was so quiet I could hear the second hand ticking in the living room. Cynthia was still asleep. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. Steady, gentle. Everything I had just lived through seemed to shrink into something very small. I pulled the blanket up a little higher for her, then softly closed the door. In the workshop, the dressing cabinet was still there, carefully covered. I turned on the light and sat down in my usual chair. My hands rested on the cool surface of the wood. For the first time in days, I felt calm. Not because I had said everything, but because I no longer had to carry silence like a weight. The next morning, I made tea and sat with Cynthia on the porch. She looked at me for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Did something happen?" I didn't go into details. I just said I'd seen Julian, that things weren't what we thought. Cynthia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine. "No matter what happens," she said, "you're still the man who stood beside me all these years." I nodded. That was enough. The days that followed passed quietly. No apology calls, no explanations. I didn't wait for any. Frank stopped by once, checked on Cynthia's health, then shook my hand firmly. "You did the right thing," he said. I didn't answer. I just smiled. News spread in its own way. Vanessa's family, people who cared deeply about reputation, withdrew all financial support. The celebration ended earlier than planned. Relationships built on incomplete stories closed on their own. I didn't take pleasure in that. I saw it only as consequence. Nothing more. One afternoon, I went back into the workshop and pulled the cloth off the cabinet. I finished the remaining details. Slowly, carefully. I no longer thought about a wedding when my hands moved over the grain. I thought about Cynthia, about quiet mornings, about the years we chose each other without lights or applause. When the cabinet was done, I didn't feel regret. I felt light. We finally made a decision we'd postponed for years. I sold the old house, not to run from memories, but because we no longer needed to cling to them. The money was enough for us to live comfortably and do what we'd promised each other long ago. Cynthia laughed when I mentioned traveling. "Do you think you still have the strength?" she asked. I laughed too. "We'll go slow." Our first trip wasn't far, just a quiet seaside town. We woke early, walked along the shore, sat with coffee, watching the sunrise. No one knew who we were. No one needed to. In the evenings, we ate simple meals and talked about small things. I realized then, happiness doesn't need to be proven. One day I stood in front of the mirror in our hotel room. The suit hung neatly in the closet. I wore an everyday shirt, sleeves rolled up. My hands were right there, old calluses, clear and worn. I studied them for a long time. I used to think those calluses were what embarrassed my son. Now I see them as evidence. Evidence of an honest working life. Of things built slowly, but solid. I don't know what Julian's future will look like. I don't know if we'll ever speak again. I only know this. From the moment I chose truth and drew a boundary, I gave myself something back. My self-respect. And when a person keeps that, they don't need to defeat anyone. On the train leaving town, Cynthia rested her head on my shoulder asleep. I looked out the window as small houses drifted away. I thought of the cabinet, the workshop, the years ahead, no climax, no applause, just a rare sense of peace. If there's one thing I'd say to anyone listening to this story, it's this. Don't build your life on lies. They may stand for a while, but they never stand for long. And don't deny your roots. Those roots are what keep you upright when all the lights go out. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The train kept moving. My story ends here, not with collapse, but with a door opening. A quiet door wide enough to let peace walk in. If you stayed with me all the way to these final words, thank you for listening. This story isn't about blaming anyone. It's a reminder that truth and self-respect always matter, even when the cost is silence from the people closest to you. If this story touched something in you, please tap like to support it, subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and share it if you think someone else needs to hear this lesson. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next story.